The Psychology of Collapse. Why Nations Never See the Revolution Coming. A Financial History Perspective. Here's something that keeps me up at night. I've spent 2 decades studying monetary collapse, sovereign defaults, and financial revolutions, and I've noticed something terrifying. The psychology of a nation about to implode is always identical. Whether it's assignats burning in Paris, rubles collapsing in St. Petersburg, or the Cuban peso becoming worthless overnight, the collective delusion beforehand is always the same. The people in power never see it coming. Not because they're stupid, but because human psychology has a fatal flaw. We cannot perceive exponential decay until it's too late. Let me explain what I mean. The first psychological break, when expectations exceed reality. In 1788, a French peasant named Jacques worked the same land his family had farmed for 200 years. He paid roughly 80% of his income in various taxes and fees. Brutal, yes, but survivable, because that's what his father did, and his grandfather before him. Then something changed. Not the taxes, the expectations. The Enlightenment had spread ideas: liberty, equality, natural rights. Jacques learned that in England, peasants paid far less. He learned that in the American colonies, people had just overthrown a king and declared independence. He learned that maybe, just maybe, the way things had always been wasn't the way things had to be. This is what economists call the revolution of rising expectations. It's not poverty that causes revolutions. It's the gap between what people have and what they believe they deserve. The psychological formula is deadly simple. Rage equals reality minus expectations. When that number goes negative far enough for long enough, societies fracture. Now, let's talk about money, because money is where this psychology becomes visible, measurable, and inevitable. The currency of trust, when money becomes psychology. Here's what most people don't understand. Money isn't real. It's collective belief. A dollar bill is worth something only because we all agree it is. The moment that agreement breaks, the currency dies. France in 1789 had a currency crisis that perfectly illustrates this. The government was bankrupt. Spending was double tax revenue. So they did what all desperate governments do. They printed money. They called it assignats, backed by confiscated church lands. At first, it worked. The assignats circulated. People accepted them. But then the printing accelerated. By 1795, the government had printed 45 billion livres worth of assignats. Inflation hit 13,000%. A loaf of bread that cost 2 sous in 1790 cost 225 livres in 1795. But here's the fascinating psychological part. The collapse didn't happen gradually. It happened in cascading waves of realization. Stage 1. The government knows what it's doing. Stage 2. This seems problematic, but
surely they'll fix it. Stage 3. Everyone else is still accepting these, so I will too. Stage 4. Wait, is anyone else worried about this? Stage 5. Get rid of these immediately. That 5th stage, when individual fear becomes collective panic, is the point of no return. And once you cross it, there's no central bank intervention, no policy speech, no emergency measure that can restore trust. Because you can't print trust. The confidence trap. Elite psychology before collapse. Now let's talk about the people in charge, because their psychology is even more fascinating. Tsar Nicholas II in 1917 was not an idiot. He had advisors, intelligence reports, economic data. He knew there were food riots. He knew soldiers were deserting. He knew the war was going badly. But he genuinely believed, until the moment he was forced to abdicate, that he was in control. This is what I call the confidence trap. Leaders in late-stage decline suffer from 3 psychological distortions. Distortion number 1. Normalcy bias. We've weathered crises before. This is just another storm. Nicholas saw the 1905 revolution fail, so when 1917 started, he assumed this too would pass. After all, the Romanovs had ruled for 300 years. Institutions that last that long seem eternal. Distortion number 2. Information bubble. When you're at the top, people tell you what you want to hear. Nicholas's courtiers assured him the people loved him. Why? Because the people who would tell him the truth weren't allowed in the room. This is happening right now in every major economy. Central bankers tell finance ministers the economy is resilient. Finance ministers tell presidents everything is under control. Presidents tell the public we've never been stronger. Meanwhile, the people buying groceries know something is deeply wrong. Distortion number 3, escalation of commitment. This is the killer. Once you've invested in a failing strategy, admitting failure feels impossible. So you double down. France kept raising taxes on peasants to pay debt, making the peasants angrier, requiring more force to collect taxes, requiring more debt to pay for that force, requiring higher taxes. Russia kept fighting World War I despite catastrophic losses because admitting defeat would mean admitting the deaths were meaningless. Cuba's Batista kept rigging elections because real elections might cost him power, so rigging seemed safer, even though it destroyed any remaining legitimacy. The psychology of power is, when changing course seems dangerous, staying the course seems safer, even when staying the course leads off a cliff. The middle-class mind: why lawyers start revolutions. Here's a pattern that repeats every single time. Revolutions are not started by the poorest. They're started by the almost comfortable. In France, the National Assembly, the body that declared itself the real government, was dominated by lawyers,
Doctors, merchants, and provincial nobles. Educated men who had expected to succeed in the existing system. In Russia, the Bolsheviks' inner circle was intellectuals, journalists, and students. Lenin was a lawyer. Trotsky was a journalist. In Cuba, Fidel Castro was a lawyer. Che Guevara was a doctor. The 26th of July movement was urban professionals, not sugarcane workers. Why? Because revolution requires 3 psychological ingredients. Education: you need to understand the system well enough to know it's rigged. Frustrated ambition: you expected to succeed and didn't. Articulation: you can explain why the system failed and what should replace it. The truly poor don't have time to organize revolutions. They're surviving. The truly rich benefit from the status quo. But the middle class? They have education, expectations, and rage. And when the middle class radicalizes, societies collapse. The trust cliff, point of no return. There's a moment in every pre-revolutionary society when something invisible but fundamental breaks. I call it the trust cliff. You can see it in the data if you know where to look. In France, in 1788, the king called the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. He thought it would legitimize new taxes. Instead, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. The moment commoners claimed sovereign authority, the monarchy was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. In Russia, February 1917, soldiers ordered to shoot protesters instead joined them. When the military stops following orders, the government is finished. In Cuba, 1958, police and army units started defecting to Castro. Batista had money, weapons, and American support. But he'd lost the one thing you can't buy: legitimacy. The trust cliff is the moment when institutions lose their psychological power. Not their legal power, not their military power, but their perceived legitimacy. And here's the terrifying part. You can't see it coming because trust erodes invisibly, then fails suddenly. Think of it like a rope holding weight. Each fiber breaks silently. One fiber doesn't matter. 10 fibers don't matter. But fiber 1437 is the one that drops the weight. And there's no way to know which fiber that is. The American Psyche, 2025. So let's talk about the United States right now, through this psychological lens. I look at monetary data every day. Treasury auctions, yield curves, currency flows. And I'm watching something unprecedented: the simultaneous loss of trust in multiple institutional pillars. Trust in currency. The dollar is still the global reserve, yes. But 63% of Americans say they're very concerned about inflation. Real wages adjusted for real inflation, not the CPI fiction, have been stagnant for 20 years. People feel poorer because they are poorer, but the official statistics say everything's fine. This is the psychological precondition for currency crisis. When lived experience contradicts official data, people trust their experience. And they start looking for exits: gold, Bitcoin, real assets, anything but dollars. Trust in institutions. Congress approval, 15%. Supreme Court, collapsing. FBI, CIA, Department of Justice, all seen as partisan weapons, depending on which side you ask. But here's what matters psychologically. It's not that people trust different institutions. It's that they believe the other side's institutions are illegitimate. 50% think the 2020 election was stolen. 50% think January 6th was a coup attempt. These aren't compatible.
Realities. When half the country believes the president is illegitimate and the other half believes the opposition is treasonous, you don't have political disagreement. You have two nations in the same borders. Trust in shared reality. This is the new factor that didn't exist in France, Russia, or Cuba. Social media has created algorithmic echo chambers where people literally live in different factual universes. It's not that we disagree on solutions. We disagree on basic reality. Did vaccines work? Was Kyle Rittenhouse defending himself or committing murder? Is climate change real? Are elections secure? Previous societies had shared facts and different interpretations. We have different facts. That's not a politics problem. That's a civilizational psychology problem. The cascade psychology. How fast can it happen? Here's what keeps me up at night as someone who studies financial history. When trust breaks, it breaks fast. The Romanov dynasty fell in 8 days. 8 days from everything's under control to Nicholas abdicating on a train. The French assignat went from legal tender to worthless paper in 18 months. Bear Stearns went from $170 per share to being sold for $2 in one weekend. Psychological breaks don't follow linear timelines. They follow cascade dynamics. For years, nothing happens. Stress builds, invisible. Then one event, often something small, triggers a cascade. And the cascade moves at the speed of information, which in 2025 is instantaneous. Imagine a scenario. A major bank fails. Not a small regional bank, a system-wide institution. The Fed steps in with a bailout, but this time, public rage is instant and massive. Protests nationwide. Both left and right agree. They bailed out the rich again. A politician promises to break the system if elected. Sounds impossible until the middle class starts thinking burn it down sounds reasonable. Or imagine a contested election. Both sides claim victory. State governments choose different presidents. The Supreme Court gets involved and splits 5-4 on partisan lines. Half the country sees a legitimate decision. Half sees a coup. Military leaders have to choose which president to follow. Do you see how fast this escalates? Not years, weeks, maybe days. The psychology of prevention. So is collapse inevitable? No, but prevention requires something psychologically almost impossible. Elites choosing to sacrifice their own privileges before they're forced to. That almost never happens, but sometimes it does. Post-World War II Europe reformed because the elites were genuinely scared. They'd seen fascism, they'd seen communism, so they built social safety nets, progressive taxation, and strong labor unions. Not out of kindness, out of fear. The question for America is, can we reform before revolution? Or will the psychology of power, the confidence trap, the information bubble, the escalation of Commitment. Make reform impossible until it's too late. The warning signs I'm watching. As someone who watches markets and monetary systems, here are the psychological indicators I'm tracking. Velocity of trust decline. Are institutions losing legitimacy faster each year? Middle-class radicalization. Are professionals and educated workers giving up on the system? Elite awareness. Do people in power understand how close to the edge we are? Pressure valve functionality. Can peaceful protest, voting, and reform still channel anger, or are those outlets failing? Right now, all four are flashing red. The final psychological truth. Every society that collapsed believed until the very end that collapse was impossible. We're too big to fail. We're too powerful. We're exceptional. France was the center of European civilization. Impossible to imagine collapse until 1789. Russia was a 300-year empire of 180 million people, too vast to fall, until 1917. America is the global superpower, richest nation in history, strongest military ever assembled, impossible to collapse,
until it's not. The psychology of collapse is always the same. Invisible strain building, elite denial, middle-class radicalization, trust erosion, and then, suddenly, cascade. The question isn't whether the pattern applies to America. The question is, which stage are we in, and how much time do we have left? Because history says, probably less than we think. And the mathematics of psychology say, when everyone believes collapse is impossible, that's when it's most inevitable. Sleep tight.